Mr. President, last week, Senator Graham and I introduced a Senate resolution condemning the murder of my friend and a true Russian patriot, Boris Nemtsov. The resolution calls upon the Russian Federation to support an independent investigation into Boris Nemtsov's murder and to take immediate steps to end its suppression of free speech and justice. It also urges President Obama to continue to sanction human rights violators in the Russian Federation and to increase U.S. support to like-minded human rights activists in Russia. My friends, I was devastated to learn of Boris's murder in Moscow last month. My thoughts and prayers remain with his family and many friends in Russia and around the world. With his death, the struggle for free speech and human rights in Russia has suffered another shattering blow. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Boris Nemtsov was one of Russia's earliest and most vigorous economic and political reformers, a champion of liberalization and democracy. His leadership of Russia's laboratory of reform eventually brought him to Moscow, where he served as deputy prime minister and was once a favorite for the Russian presidency. But then Russia took a dark turn when Vladimir Putin entered the Kremlin. Boris Yeltsin was one of the first to warn of the coming Putin dictatorship, even when many of his fellow liberals could not see it. As Putin's grip on power tightened, Boris Nemtsov's hope for a free, just, and economically vibrant Russia, at home and at peace in Europe, were dashed. Yet even after multiple arrests and countless threats on his life, Boris never stopped fighting the corruption and lawlessness of the Putin regime, never stopped seeking to advance democracy, human rights, free speech, free market reforms, and the rule of law. In December 2011, Boris Nemtsov helped mobilize the largest anti-Kremlin demonstrations since the early 1990s, leading tens of thousands of Russians to march in protest of widespread fraud and corruption in the parliamentary elections. He stood up to harsh laws that vastly expanded the definition of treason, increased government control over the media, and limited the scope and activities of opposition parties and civil society organizations. Laws that Vladimir Putin and his cronies have exploited to intimidate the Russian people into obedience. Shortly before his death, Boris Nemtsov was reportedly planning to release a report on Russia's military involvement in Ukraine. At the protest march scheduled 2 days after his murder, he was set to demand, quote, the immediate end to the war and any aggressive efforts towards Ukraine. He investigated and saw through the fabricated rationalization of Putin's war. Putin didn't invade Ukraine to protect Russian-speaking peoples or to establish a federal state. Putin didn't invade Ukraine because he's crazy or merely to reassert Russia's sphere of influence in the near abroad. Rather, Boris Nemtsov wrote that the goal of Putin's fratricidal war is the preservation of personal power and money at any cost, a cold strategy for lifelong despotism. Putin was willing to doom Russia to isolation and sanctions and to sink his country into lies, violence, obscurantism, and imperial hysteria for his own personal power and enrichment. As Boris Nemtsov knew, this is not Russia's war, this is not Ukraine's war, this is Vladimir Putin's war. That's why Boris Yeltsin's murder, Nemtsov's murder, was not just a tragedy for the people of Russia, but for the people of Ukraine. He was one of the few brave Russians who sought to pierce the veneer of Putin's cynical and false narrative that Russia is not at war in Ukraine. There are many who now believe that Boris is yet another casualty of that war. At the Memorial March honoring his life in Moscow on Sunday, one woman held a sign that read, "The war killed Nemtsov." I had long been concerned about Boris's safety and said so publicly. I will never forget the last meeting we had in my office. I begged him to be careful, and Boris told me that he would never give up the fight for freedom, human rights, and rule of law for his fellow Russians, even if it cost him his life. I am heartbroken that it has come to that. That Boris Nemtsov murder occurred on a bridge in the shadow of the Kremlin in one of the most secure parts of the Russian capital raises serious questions about the circumstances of his killing and who was responsible. In KGB fashion, Vladimir Putin will round up all the usual suspects, but I fear we will never know who really pulled the trigger that night. Putin's partial oversight of the investigation ensures that it will be a sham. But we don't need any investigation to know who is responsible for Boris's murder. Vladimir Putin may not have ordered Boris's assassination, but perhaps what is most frightening about Putin's Russia is that he didn't need to. Boris is dead because of the culture of impunity that Vladimir Putin has created in Russia, where individuals are routinely persecuted and attacked for their beliefs, including by the Russian government, and no one is ever held responsible. Sadly, Boris Nemtsov is not the first and certainly will not be the last victim of Putin's repression. The culture of impunity is steadily worsened, deepened by the increased surveillance and harassment of members of opposition and civil society groups, the ongoing detention of numerous political prisoners, and by the continued violent attacks on brave journalists who dare to publish the truth about official corruption and other state crimes in Russia. According to one news report, at least 23 journalists have been murdered in Russia for reporting on government criminality and abuse since Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, along with several anti-Kremlin political activists. In only 2 of these cases have there been convictions. Igor Domnikov, a reporter writing about government corruption, was severely beaten in Moscow and died 2 months later. Sergei Yushchenkov, a leader of a Russian opposition party, was shot and killed at the entrance of his apartment building. At the time, he was serving on a commission investigating the criminal's potential role in the 1999 apartment bombings in Russia. Another member of that commission, a reporter investigating corruption in Russian law enforcement, was poisoned to death. American journalist Paul Klebnikov was investigating Russian government connections to organized crime when he was shot to death in Moscow. Anna Politkovskaya, a journalist and human rights activist, was a fierce critic of Vladimir's brutal war in Chechnya. She was murdered in the stairwell of her apartment building on Vladimir Putin's birthday in 2006. The lawyer who represented her family later survived a poisoning attempt. Former FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko exposed the Putin regime's massive corruption, ties to organized crime, and involvement in assassination and murder. He was poisoned in 2006 with a radioactive isotope in a brazen act of nuclear terrorism. Ivan Safronov was investigating a secret sale of Russian missiles and fighter jets to Syria and Iran. He was pushed to his death from the window of his Moscow apartment. Sergei Magnitsky blew the whistle on tax fraud and large-scale theft by Russian government officials. He was thrown into one of Russia's harshest prisons without trial, beaten and tortured, denied medical care, and died in excruciating pain. Even after his death, the Russian courts convicted him of tax evasion in a show trial. As Orwell once wrote, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." Russia has fewer and fewer revolutionaries, but Boris Nemtsov was certainly one of them. Boris told the truth and was willing to lay down his life for it. He told the truth about Putin's reign of terror and hatred. He told the truth about Putin's kleptocracy, rampant corruption, and systematic theft perpetrated against the Russian people. He told the truth about Putin's illegal invasion of the sovereign nation of Ukraine and Russia's continued support for violence, instability, and terror. Boris told the truth, and we must honor his memory by speaking these same truths fearlessly. Our nation and free people everywhere must draw strength from Boris's example and continue to resist Vladimir Putin's dark and dangerous view of the world. Last Sunday, over 50,000 Russians marched in tribute to Boris Nemtsov, still seeking, despite the odds, what a Russian poet once called the footprints of the forgotten truth. At his funeral on Tuesday, thousands more waited in line for more than an hour in the cold to pay Boris their respects. Finally, as the hearse carrying Boris Nemtsov pulled away, mourners tossed flowers and chanted, "Russia will be free." As I remember my friend Boris Nemtsov, that is my most sincere hope and fervent prayer. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.